Good afternoon and welcome. My name's Kevin Igo, Managing Director of PFP, and I've been delighted today to be joined by Katie Hampton, who's a national minimum wage specialist. Now, national minimum wage is something that I think many firms think doesn't really apply to them or their clients, moreover. And in reality, of course, it does. It relates to most employers, well, all employers have to attend or agree to it. So, if I could just introduce Katie. Katie, perhaps you could just say hello to our listeners and a little bit about your background, please.
Oh, of course. Thank you for that, Kevin. Hi, everybody. Lovely to meet you all. My name's Katie Hampton, and I am a national minimum wage specialist. My background was previously with HMRC enforcement for 12 years, so everything right from deliberate and serious non-compliance right through to enforcement of large and complex business. And then in the last couple of years is jumping over the other side of the fence and really helping employers and accountants and advisors with the complexities of HMRC inquiries. So yeah, hopefully I should be well positioned to answer any questions and to take you through some minimum wage compliance and HMRC enforcement tips.
Yes, thank you. So, as usual, we will be sending around a copy of the slides at the end of the webinar, and if the recording holds up, we can send around a recording as well. So, as Katie said, if anybody has any questions, please send them through in the usual way in the questions box. She has said to me she hopes she gets some really difficult ones to challenge her, so feel free to ask as many as you can. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Katie.
Wonderful, thank you. Right, so let's get cracking straight away. Here are some of the headlines of employers and organisations that have found themselves in the press over national minimum wage issues. So as you can see, some huge names and some big numbers, which to me really demonstrates that it doesn't matter what size employer you are or your clients are, sorry, there's still potential there to make a mistake in this area. Now, from my experience of being on both sides of the investigation and understanding the stories behind the majority of these employers, is that it isn't, in my view, your rogue businesses that are finding themselves in this really costly and damaging position. It's the majority of the time responsible employers who are trying to do the right thing or even have strong and loyal commitments to their workforce are finding themselves in this position through technical misunderstandings or from not having robust policies and procedures in place. So what I'd love to share with you today is how HMRC enforcement has evolved over the last couple of years, so you can really start to think about your own clients and their policies and procedures. We're going to touch on who's more likely to be at risk and why. We'll then move into some pointers of how to establish compliance and some of the common issues and themes of where businesses are going wrong, and hopefully you'll have some examples when you're thinking about your clients. And again, like Kevin mentioned, love some questions about what you're experiencing. That would be absolutely great. We'll touch on some of the consequences of making a breach, and then I promise you it's not going to be all doom and gloom. I'd hopefully like to be able to cover with you some helpful tips on how we can support employers and clients with their HMRC investigations, and also why being proactive is absolutely key to keep their name out of the headlines. So to start with then, so how enforcement has evolved. So minimum wage legislation is over 23 years old, and although it's been transformative for the UK labour market in increasing pay for the lower paid workers, it has absolutely become a minefield for employers to comply with the rules. And then also, once they are compliant, how the chuff do they remain compliant? Because that, again, it's an ongoing thing that needs to be considered on an ongoing basis. And because of that, unfortunately, that's why we see many inadvertently falling foul of the legislation through technical misunderstandings and through accidental mistakes. Now, if we were to go back 5 years ago, in my opinion, not many employers were aware of how easy it was to make a mistake. And also, I say this not to offend anybody on the call, but I also don't think, going back 5 years ago, many advisors, accountants, lawyers, HR advisors were also aware of how easy it was to make a mistake. So again, weren't highlighting things to clients to make sure that they weren't at risk. But that's definitely started to change. More employers than ever have this on the agenda. Many, particularly a larger business, are looking at centralized minimum wage governance and working with people like myself on how do they make sure that they remain compliant, and where do they have the responsibility spread out. Similar with your advisors, probably why you've all joined this call. You're now becoming aware that it's really easy for your clients to make a mistake in this space. So again, you're wanting to help them in this area, to highlight things, to make sure when things are structured, they're going to be structured in the right way and not put them at risk of a minimum wage breach. Now that shift has came from the government investing a substantial amount of money in minimum wage enforcement. That went from just over 8 million, tripling to over 27 million the following year. Huge increase. But what that allowed HMRC to do was to rapidly increase their resources. There was a shift in HMRC's strategy, which I'm going to touch on with you. Strengthening the enforcement toolkit, so really penalising businesses and making them feel the pain when they make a mistake in this area. That's through increasing penalties from 100% of any underpayment right up to now 200% of underpayment. So that's with your penalties. And then the naming and shaming, and how that has evolved over the last couple of years as well. And that shift in the enforcement strategy is evident in HMRC's record-breaking results. In the last 5 years, they've identified a whopping 100 million in arrears for over 1 million workers. Absolutely huge numbers. But if we were to drill that down into a year, you'll be able to see the significant shift since the budget increase. So just over 3 million for 26 workers was pre-budget increase, and then after that, the following year, it was 24 million for 220 workers. Significant difference. Penalties, if you see the difference in that, less than 1 million compared to 17 million. So you get my drift. There's definitely been a change with that. Now, when I look at them stats and being a part of that, I guess when I was at HMRC, as a compliance officer, really I should have been, we should have been over the moon that would identify 24 million for workers. God, that's absolute massive amount. But actually, because of the type of work that we were doing and how that money was being identified, it really didn't feel like a significant success compared to the work that we were doing. And I'll explain more of what I mean by that if you're wondering what the hell she's talking about. But that's because there was a shift in strategy of the type of work, the type of business that would have been audited, and a lot of the issues that were being identified were well, I believe, were slightly different. So if I was to take you back to then, so before the increase in budget, we were a really small team. There was about 100 of us running around like headless chickens, dealing with 100% complaints. So where a worker would pick up the phone and raise an issue that they believed that they weren't being paid correctly, we would go out and investigate that. But that type of work felt like we were really on the front line, helping vulnerable workers being exploited, had opportunity to expose modern day slavery. Absolutely incredible work, very fulfilling. And then when we had that, actually, it's probably quite important to note actually at that time as well. So dealing with more of rogue employers is what it felt like to me. But also if we came across a responsible employer, we had a lot of discretion, so we were able to educate, we were able to help a business put it right, pay money back to workers where it was due, but not harshly penalise them to the point where you put them out of business or you force them into making, you know, a round of redundancies because they can't afford to pay the minimum wage bill from the investigation. That's how it felt to me back then. But then after that budget increase, there was a massive increase in the resources, and so way more people on the road being able to do this work. And then what HMRC did off the back of that was set up what was called specialist enforcement teams. And this was a team to specifically audit and target larger business, because actually we never audited a large business. And if we did get a complaint about a large business, because they were so large and complex and we didn't have the resource at the time, was we would just deal with that specific worker the majority of the time, get them to put it right, and not really having a deep dive into their working practices and what they were doing. So this team was set up to specifically look at your largest and most complex of business. Also, we were targeting specific sectors as well. So instead of just dealing with complaints, we were dealing with specific sectors. So warehouse and distribution, manufacturing, construction, hospitality, and the like. So this was where we weren't waiting for a complaint and we were going in and doing routine inspections. Now, from doing that work, what we identified was like, oh my days, so much money being identified through technical misunderstandings of the legislation, or from the way that benefit schemes were set up, for example, or where a business had actually wanted to support their employees, so they would set up certain arrangements to support the employees, but actually HMRC, we would go in and go, actually that's caught by the legislation. And also that discretion that I talked about previously, because there was such a massive increase in compliance officers over the year, over that year, and there was a lot more, there was a lack of experience. We needed to have consistency across the board. So to get the consistency across the board was also to take away some of that discretion that we had when we were a lot smaller. So where we were able to step in and do education work, that was kind of stripped away. So it made sense to get the consistency, but with that consistency made a very strict interpretation of the legislation, and that many businesses were getting, on occasions, just my personal opinion, very harshly penalised when they'd had that technical misunderstanding. Now we are going to touch on some of them common issues and themes and some of them technical breaches, just so I can give you a little bit more context of what that looks like in practice, because that's going to be the main point. For you to be able to take away when you're thinking about your own questions. Yep, we've got a question.
If we just start with a couple of questions here. From Alex, is there a link between national minimum wage and pay-as-you-earn inspections, or are they totally independent?
So your RTI information absolutely becomes part of the risk profiling and how HMRC would go in and audit, or pick a certain sector, for example. So your RTI information. So to answer that, I would say yes, in a number of different ways. Sometimes your inspections from pay-as-you-earn, HMRC, compliance officers will flag up and pass the work over to minimum wage if they see an issue. But then there's also the other side of the internal risk profiling through your RTI information. So looking at using a number of different ways, but one example would be if there's large deductions going through the RTI information, HMRC might pick that up as a risk as part of their profiling to then go in and do an inspection.
Okay, so thank you. Sarah's asked, yeah, thank you. Sarah's asked some questions, or has a question on the selection procedures. You mentioned that up until recently, it was only complaints that led to inspections, and now there's routine inspections on top. how are people selected? And Sarah's question is, if my client gets a letter or a telephone call saying there's a national minimum wage inspection, do I automatically assume they're doing something wrong?
So how the HMRC is still dealing with complaints. I think because we were so busy, we didn't have time to do any targeting previously. But HMRC is still investing millions every year to do education. So there is still risk of a complaint. Now, on the other side of that, just to answer the question, they're actively targeting specific sectors. So they'll do projects in certain areas. So warehousing, manufacturing, hospitality, retail. So if you've got clients in that space who have never had an inspection before, it's likely that they're going to be on a list to come up and have an inspection through that. The second part of that question, is it that they could be doing something wrong? How I always if I'm able to get in there at an earlier stage with an employer, as soon as that letter lands on the doorstep, in an ideal scenario, they're going to be reaching back out to you to say, okay, what does this mean? Because actually they will be at risk if they've never had an audit before, that there may be some technical misunderstandings there or potential accidental breaches, if that makes sense. So coming in as early as possible, I always treat that as, okay, let's see what there is, if there is anything there. Not to say that they've done anything deliberately, but it's so easy to make a mistake that they could be at risk. Just one final point.
Yep.
I was just going to say, just a final point on that. If I audited 10 businesses, if I was auditing at HMRC, 8 of them I would find a problem with. Usually the other 2 is because they've already had a routine inspection beforehand. So it is a high proportion that you'd be able to find something in there if they haven't done any proactive work to protect themselves. So hopefully that answers that question.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so Barry's asked about the penalties as a result. Firstly, is the penalty regime different than taxes, as it were? And secondly, who gets the interest and penalties? Because it's not HMRC that have suffered, it's the underlying employee, presumably.
Yeah, well, we're going to touch on the consequences of a breach. So if that's all right, Barry, we'll hold that question until further on, but we definitely cover all of them if that's all right.
Great. Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Is that all right for a few? Fab.
Yep.
Yeah, so hopefully from there you get an idea of who's more likely to be at risk and why. So because HMRC are doing 100, they're doing a lot of work with workers. They're doing social media campaigns. They're doing text messages in certain areas. They're doing, I've noticed, driving around, that you see them on bus shelters as well. So they are working with workers to raise awareness so that they are more likely to pick up the phone and to raise a complaint. So I guess the simple answer is everyone's at risk, but then the default to that would be, if it's not a complaint, it's actively targeting specific sectors. Now, there may be a project also in the pipeline, because I've had 3 queries this month from hotels. So if you've got clients in the hotel space, I do think that there must be some kind of project that HMRC has picked up, because for me to have 3 about a hotel in a very short space of time to me is saying, are we doing another hotel project? And because the risks in a hotel can be, it's quite easy to make a mistake in that kind of setting. Then yeah, that's just what I'm starting to see. So okay, so we get the gist then of, we've had a shift, who's going to be at risk, that it's really easy to make a mistake. But how I like to work with employers to try and simplify a really complex subject, and how they can start to look at establishing compliance when thinking about their own compliance levels, is in 5 key areas. So although it's really simple in theory, like I've just mentioned, it's really easy to make a mistake. And also, one of the most common things that I would hear when I was at HMRC, I don't hear it as much because they're working with me for a reason, but especially at HMRC, if I was going to come out or investigate someone, the line that would come out of an employer's mouth would be, I'm absolutely fine, we'll be okay, come in and audit us because we pay rates that are above, that are the published rates or above the published rates, so we should be okay. You hear that so often. Unfortunately, yes, paying rates above minimum wage reduces the risk, but it definitely isn't risk-free. And that's because these 5 areas need their own considerations to make sure that the overall compliance is that you're comfortable with that compliance status. So just to touch on some of these key areas, we'll not go into too much detail because some of these can get quite technical, and that's definitely for another day. But as soon as we are happy that they're definitely a worker, so obviously you've got your self-employed and your status queries, again, a whole nother subject. But if you're comfortable that they're definitely a worker, these are the 5 things that I would be thinking about. So your first one is the worker type. It's really important that an employer understands what the worker type is of their workforce. And the reason for that is because there is different considerations needed and different calculations needed depending on the worker type. The simplest one to identify is your timed worker. So this is usually your hourly paid workers. You work an hour, you get paid an hour. There's a fluctuation in pay. They're usually the most simplest to identify, and they're also probably the most common worker type. Your second most common type, I believe, is your salaried work, but this is the most complex of worker types. There's so many different things that need to be considered around compliance of salaried work. The first point is making sure that for minimum wage purposes, they meet the contract actually meets the strict criteria to be classed as salaried for minimum wage purposes. And then after you're comfortable that they're definitely salaried work, it's then, okay, how do you then make sure that you've got the right processes in place to make sure that that salary is enough over the year to cover minimum wage. So that's usually your pay averaging, so your annual salary for an annual number of hours. Your output work is I'd say your least common worker type. You don't really see this very often. An example of that is like daily average agreements and when people are paid based on productivity, for example. An example of that is when I did Premier League football clubs, actually, they had quite a few output workers. So they were say program sellers, so you'll get paid per program that you sold as opposed to based on your time that you physically worked. So if you sold more programs, you'd earn more money than what you would if you sold less. So that's an example of output worked. And then the default one is if you're not any of the other 3, you will default to unmeasured work, which is where workers need to be paid for all of at least minimum wage for all of the time that they are spent working. So once you're comfortable with the worker type, and many businesses have two different, maybe even 2 or 3 different worker types on the same workforce. So you might have some hourly paid people, you might have some salaried paid people, and you might also think some people are salaried, but actually they don't meet the criteria, so they default to unmeasured work. So that's why it's really important that businesses know what worker type it is, because there's different calculations needed for each one. So once you've established that, the next thing is understanding what the pay reference period is from a minimum wage point of view. So whether it be weekly PRP or monthly, fortnightly. So once you've identified that, again, you might have hourly paid on a weekly payroll, salaried on a monthly. The next one is your working time. So an employer needs to be comfortable that they are capturing all working time within their minimum wage calculation. And if there's any additional time that needs to be considered that they don't have in their start and their finishing time. I'll leave working time for the next section because it is a really common area that causes quite a lot of problems for a lot of businesses. So we'll touch on some examples on that further on. As part of that, it's really important that employers are meeting their legal obligation to retain sufficient time records to demonstrate that they're paying people minimum wage. That will be That's just changed. So historically, businesses had to retain the records for up to 3 years, for 3 years. And the legislation's just been updated last year, and that has now been extended to 6 years. So yeah, they need to be keeping time records to demonstrate that. Elements of pay is then what I believe is the next important factor of once you're comfortable with the previous 3 sections. So I mentioned on the worker type, the reason there's different calculations and different considerations. This is one of the main differences between the different worker types, is that elements of pay. So not all elements of pay count towards minimum wage. As an example, for example, time workers, if they've got enhancements within their pay on their hourly rate, if they work in bank holidays, for example, that enhancement element needs to be stripped out of the calculation, cannot be included. So that's why it's important to know what pay elements are being paid and can they be included or not included. And why that's important is especially when you're doing things like salary sacrifice and deductions from pay. So once you're comfortable that you know if it can be included or not included on the pay elements, you then move down into your salary sacrifice and your deductions from pay. And are the deductions allowable from a minimum wage point of view, or could they reduce pay and then put the compliance status at risk? So yeah, they're the key points. So just to briefly touch on that, I'll not go into, we're going to touch on some of the common issues on the next slide, where we'll drill down into some of these a little bit more.
Okay, we have a quick question from Ben. Thank you, Ben. How does having to buy a uniform from their employer affect the calculation? Does this still affect the national minimum wage calculation if they are required to buy certain items, e.g. a particular colour?
Oh, good question, and a really common issue. So yeah, so if we've got, so your example there, Ben, if we've got an employer who is asking for black shoes and black trousers, this is a really complex issue to address. You know, I definitely do a lot of work with employers to make sure when that is being addressed, because that can be a substantial amount of money, especially when you're going back over a 6-year period. It can have an impact on the calculation. I say can have because I literally help businesses challenge this particular point with HMRC. You know, to make sure that if that is going to be addressed, it's only going to be addressed because it's definitely proven that there's an issue. But where that needs to come into that calculation, I would say this end box where we've got deductions, we would put payments in there as well. So for example, if you've got a timed worker who's paid bang on minimum wage, but then HMRC come along and say, right, I've spoken to your workers and your workers tell me that they're spending £25 on black shoes and black trousers. What HMRC would like to do in that scenario is put £25 into this bottom box to then run that minimum wage calculation. That's in simple terms. You know, there's lots of different considerations around when does it apply, what pay reference period do you put it in, and things like that. But say, for example, if we were looking at July and he was paid bang on minimum wage, £25 be included. Oh, there's a shortfall of £25. That would be the underpayment. That's how HMRC try and treat that. So hopefully that answers that question. That's how they would look at that.
Okay, great, thank you.
But there is some things that you can do with that. So if you've got a query with that, then I would definitely say, well, speak to me and I'll help you with that. All right. Any more questions, or should we move on?
No, let's click on.
Fabulous. So why are businesses getting caught out, and why is it so easy to make a mistake, and why is it really common? So definitely the main thing is that there's a lack of awareness and understanding that it's easy to make a mistake. The complexity of the legislation and how we've just tried to simplify it on that last slide, there's loads of floating parts that need to be considered to make sure that you're being compliant. Poor guidance, you know what, actually I say that and that's maybe a little bit of an unfair comment to HMRC, because they have just done a lot of work around trying to improve the guidance and to help employers a little bit more, but it's only as good as if you know what you're looking for. And again, as tried to mention on the previous page, you need to understand each area. So you could look at one area and not realise that actually if you make a change based on one area, you're not realising that actually you could chuck out another area and cause a technical misunderstanding. So yeah, and then finally it's this having a mindset that we pay rates in excess of minimum wage and the published rates, so it should be enough and we should be all right. Here that's so common. Or another one is we're a living wage employer. We don't have a problem. I mean, the majority that end up on the naming and shaming list, a lot of them are living wage employers. So again, that's not always enough. And some examples then, so to talk you through, to put a little bit of context into some of these complexities. So the main one of the first ones where it's, falling at the first hurdle is this wrongly identifying the correct worker type. To demonstrate that, a lot of employers will believe that they are operating salaried work, for example, not realising that there's a strict criteria to meet, and not realising that actually their contract doesn't meet that criteria. Now, if their contract doesn't meet that criteria, what often happens is that worker type will default from salaried to unmeasured work. And when that happens, what it means is that you can no longer operate pay averaging and hours averaging over an annual basis. It then defaults to needing an assessment done on an individual pay reference period basis. I'm currently working with a client at the minute who's been through a messy inquiry with HMRC, not realising they needed representation at the time, and they've received there's just a smallish business, and they've received a settlement of over 200k because of their term time workers, and HMRC believing that term time contract doesn't meet the definition of salaried work. Now, if we were to look at that contract on an annual basis, the employer's got absolutely no problems, we're paying enough. But what HMRC have done, have come in and said, actually, you've fallen down on that criteria and we need to default that to an unmeasured worker. Now, what that means is that in the periods that the term time workers are working, they're working way more hours, but then they're relying on when they're 6 weeks holiday, 2 weeks off at Christmas and all of that, when they're getting paid for not work, but actually you can't offset that amount against the underpayment. Now, I mean, luckily they've obviously come forward and I've said I absolutely do not agree with HMRC's determination. We're straight into right, let me present that better, in a way that is going to hit the legislation, and we're in the process of doing that. So luckily, they're not going to need to make workers redundant off the back of that. I'm quite confident that we've done enough to demonstrate that actually they are salaried workers. But that's how easy it is to make a mistake, and that's the likes of John Lewis being in the media for 36 million because they've made a mistake on a contract through salaried and unmeasured work and things like that. So yeah, that's really important. And also a query I think that I got last week was quite an interesting, a common one as well. So like, say for example, manufacturing businesses, they quite often have they'll pay people an average of 40 hours a week, but they'll do rotas over a 2-week period. So in 1 week they might be working 60 hours, and then the next week they're working 20 hours, for example, but the employer will pay an average of 40 hours in each week. Now, what quite often happens in manufacturing businesses, they usually pay other elements of pay, which sometimes, a lot of the time, would knock them out of the salaried work criteria from a historical point of view. And in that scenario, that can cause massive underpayments because you're not able to offset your overpayment in the 20-week against the 60-hour week. So hopefully that simplifies how easy that is to make a mistake in that space. Moving on to your working time. So working time is, again, a really common issue. So in practice, what this looks like is an employer might have a start and finishing time, say 8 till 4, not realising that HMRC are going to come in and ask your workers if they're doing anything beforehand. So is there any time before the start of the shift? Are we changing into uniforms, for example? Are we going through any security checks? Are we a call centre that's setting up computers and phone systems beforehand? Are we a hairdressing business where we're required to come in 15 minutes early to turn on the coffee machine and get the towels out and things like that? So it's looking at if there's any potential at the beginning of the shift and similar to at the end of the shift. So is there any additional working time that might need to be included? Again, security checks or cashing up tills, for example, or dealing with customers before the end of the shift. So it's making sure, again, that's what HMRC would look at through their inspections, if there's any additional work and time. Deductions and salary sacrifice are another really common area of accidental mistakes. So your salary sacrifice, when you're sacrificing salary, your minimum wage assessment needs to be done at that point, and we need to be making sure that at no point pay is brought below minimum wage after the sacrifice. Now, why, again, that's really easy to have a mistake is if we're including pay elements that aren't allowed to be included from a minimum wage point of view. Could we be inflating the minimum wage pay when we're doing the salary sacrifice assessment? That's an example. Or even just not even having awareness. So quite often, you see this quite often in larger businesses, they'll have people where they are coming up to retirement, for example, and they might be on a lot higher salary, not close to minimum wage at all, 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 grand or whatever, but then they plow in a load of money into voluntary pension contributions, not realising that we need to be also making sure that there's minimum wage check, because in HMRC's reviews, they're not looking at the top line of, well, they get paid a massive amount of money before the sacrifice and they also getting a massive benefit from doing that. HMRC wouldn't look at that. They just literally want to see what is based on the hours that they work, does the pay cover them? So that's your salary sacrifice. Your deductions from pay are another area of really easy to make a mistake. And I always say to all my clients, right, print me off a pay and deductions report and we'll literally run through every single deduction on their payroll and go, is that allowed or non-allowable? Does it reduce pay? Does it present a risk? And a good way of looking at deductions is to split it up into two sections. So first section is there a deduction in connection with their employment? So is the tools, training, any uniform deductions, any training on leaving for mandatory training. So yeah, I would usually put them in one section, and then I'll also look at deductions that are usually, well, they're considered, HMRC would look at them from are them deductions for the employer's own use or benefit. Even if the deduction benefits the employee and doesn't benefit the employer, HMRC will look at how that's structured to see if they're caught by the legislation. And this is one that is really hard to swallow for many employers because it can come up with massive figures when they've tried to do great things with their workers. Some examples, I've got Christmas savings clubs, for example, and it's one that I'm really passionate about challenging with HMRC because it has a massive impact. And to me, HMRC are using their enforcement to actually give workers who were participating in Christmas Savings Club financial gains over those that don't. So really what ends up happening in that scenario is an employer ends up having to pay double the money back. I mean, talk about savings rates. You're over 100% on your savings rate. And some of them, when we've got people that are participating for over they've been in it for 6 years, sometimes you're talking, an employee getting 12 grand back just for participating in the scheme, even though they've had the £12,000 back already. But then they get interest on top of that because we calculated at the current rates. And then we've got penalties on top of that. So yeah, that's definitely one that, I'm definitely keen to help challenge and put a different perspective on it to see if we can change how HMRC enforce that. Similar to another thing which, you know, your clients might do actually, because this one's quite common, is, you know, I was working with an employer out of Heathrow Airport, for example, an amazing business, absolutely lovely employer, and offered subsidised car parking. So the workers entered into the arrangement voluntarily and were receiving discounted car parking. They were definitely paying less car parking than what I was with HMRC, but although mine wasn't through the payroll, HMRC obviously didn't have any, didn't impact their compliance status. But what had happened in this one is, quite often, because of how it's structured, it was going through the payroll, and this is where it then causes problems. So in that scenario, you know, HMRC were trying to enforce substantial money, you know, with, when you're talking penalties of over $1 million for trying to help the employees. Now, luckily in that scenario, we're able to really challenge how HMRC looked at that, because that also, yes, of course, we want to support the employer to not get penalised for that kind of thing, but also it has a detrimental impact on the workers, which, you know, take away that subsidised car parking and that changes everything. Their travel costs go up, you know, paying massive amounts at airport car parking. And then also sometimes it's, well, I can't afford the car park, and how do I actually get to work? I'll have to change how I get there. Do I get the train, increase in time and stuff like that? So that's why it's really important with these kind of deductions, with benefit schemes and stuff like that, whether it be tea clubs, lottery funds, it's making sure that it's not putting them at risk from minimum wage point of view, but also not having a detrimental impact on the worker, and can it be restructured so that it keeps HMRC off their back. Uniform, we've just touched on with, was it Ben's question, I think it was, wasn't it? So I'll not go into too much detail, but that's definitely an area really easy to make a mistake. Quite often what happens with this is that you don't have an employer with an overarching policy of uniform, but actually they haven't realised that in practice we've got local policies being implemented, which is quite often what happens. You know, head office might not be aware that in some of the sites we've got managers that are asking, because they worked at another business and all their workers will dress smartly in black shoes and black trousers, that they want the workers out of their site to be looking at that. So again, it's making sure that the policies don't bring a breach, but actually what happens in practice is also the same. And then you've got your usual payroll considerations, so your rate changes, your birthday changes, and your apprenticeship changes as well. So there's lots of other stuff. There's definitely not an exhausted list, but hopefully it gives you a couple of examples of where businesses are getting caught out.
Okay, we got a couple of questions here, or three questions. Can we use holiday pay where the holiday, no, can we use holiday pay where holiday taken to offset potential national minimum wage underpayment due to training, a deduction, as it is a payment for absence, not working time like pay in lieu of notice?
So depending on what the worker type is of the business, of the workers, depends on how you would treat holiday pay. So usually your holiday pay gets taken out of your calculation. So take the holiday pay out of the calculation because the hours are coming out. Then you would do your minimum wage assessment. So based on what you've just asked there, normally it would be a no. The reason why I say normally is because if they say, for example, an unmeasured worker and you're paying rolled up holiday pay, then that could change the how that's assessed, if you know what I mean, because you would you would leave the rolled up holiday pay in that scenario. But how I usually advise clients on that space from a risk point of view is make sure that we're doing any assessments taking out the holiday pay and use that across the board so that there's no issues.
Okay, David asks, how does voluntary pension contributions affect national minimum wage?
So your voluntary contributions are, so if it's like your salary sacrifice, for example, you need to do the minimum wage assessment after the sacrifice. So it would be making sure that the hours that they physically worked in that individual pay reference period doesn't bring pay below minimum wage.
Okay, and David further seeks confirmation, really, as much as anything. If the employer supplies a uniform and they choose to buy their own shoes, then is that not also voluntary?
So with voluntary uniform, if we've got so you're okay with that? Yes. So as long as your uniform policy is quite tight. So if you've got a policy that's saying we want you to wear X, Y, and Z, and we give you this, but you choose to, actually, this is a good example in, say, construction. So if we're saying, right, we're going to supply you with a pair of safety boots, but actually the worker wants a set of Timberlands or whatever, as long as there's an option for them to pay that to use the boots, we're all right if they're spending more money on Timberlands.
Okay, great stuff. And before we move on, Kat has asked, I have a client that the employees bank some hours at the normal rate. They then claim these back if they go on holiday or to top up SSP. At this point, they pay tax NIC. Is this allowed? They don't go under the national minimum wage as they get paid £1 per hour over the rate.
So I think I had a query last week with a big scheme set up in this way. So we're working more hours, we're banking out. So are we doing toil then? Is that what we're saying? So banking hours and then taking them off at a later date. So
Yes.
toil, is that, yeah, okay. So toil, time off in lieu, is not recognised on minimum wage legislation. So you need to be really careful with toil. So if we were to be looking at an individual pay reference period, we need to be making sure that people are always paid minimum wage for the hours that they physically work. And where toil comes in a little bit differently is with salaried work, but we need to be keeping a check of that fluctuation in hours. So if they're definitely salaried workers, we can operate that flexibility, but as long as we're keeping a track of it. So if they're working more hours in 1 month because we're in a peak, and then 2 months later they're going to drop their hours because they want to they're not working as much, then that would be fine, as long as we're keeping a track of the peaks and troughs and that they're unsalaried. If they're not unsalaried and they're a timed worker, we have to be definitely careful with it, because we need to be making sure that they're paid minimum wage. Now, you mentioned there that there's a buffer in pay of £1. As long as your pound is covering the additional hours, you're all right. But if it brings it below, there's a risk.
Okay, and lastly, before we move on, Tom's asked, do they have to tell you why your client's been selected?
No, so they don't need to tell you. I mean, depending on what kind of officers you have, they may share that there has been a complaint, or they may just say that it's a routine inspection, and they don't have to tell you. I mean, I often ask as part of rapport building at the beginning with HMRC, and quite often they'll share if it is or if it isn't, or in the opening letter I can usually tell if it's going to be a complaint or not, because of the specific requests.
Okay.
So yeah.
Does the officer have a right to interview staff?
Yes. So as part of HMRC's inspection, as part of that will be, after their initial fact finding with the employer, they have the powers to then speak to the workers, and that usually does form part of any inquiry. As the next stage, they will, the second stage would be to interview the workers, and that's usually where it all goes a bit peak-tongue, if I'm honest. So when HMRC then go in and speak to the workers, that's when things start to come out the woodwork that the employer wasn't aware that they had a risk or a weakness.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned pay reference period. Does that vary according to the worker's contract?
So pay reference periods would be if you're paying them weekly, monthly, fortnightly. So usually employers will have the same pay reference period, and they'll just be consistent throughout. Obviously, if they then if they take on a second contract, like a second job at the same employer, for example, and if they're on weekly on one and then monthly on the other, then you might have differences there. But you usually see the pay reference period staying consistent throughout.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
That all right?
Yep, thank you.
Moving on. Okay, so was this Barry's question, maybe? I think it was Barry. Right. Consequences of making a breach absolutely can be really expensive and damaging. So what usually happens if HMRC identify a weakness, what they'll look to do is have it over a 6-year period, and they'll be looking to have underpayments calculated in each individual pay reference period. That includes current workers and ex-workers. Once we've calculated the underpayments, that's uplifted to the current rates of minimum wage. That kind of acts like a bit of interest for the employees. So I think you kind of mentioned that, Barry, on your question. So yes, there's that's what the arrears actually is. So that's usually at an increased amount. To kind of work in that way, like interest. Then you have penalties based on the underpayment, and that's up to 200%. So I say up to because previously it was set at 100%, but I think it was 2016 off the top of my head, we went to 200% penalties on any underpayment found. So as you can see, that can have a huge, massive impact. And then every investigation that HMRC do, they make a referral on to BIS as part of the naming and shaming scheme. And then off the back of that, BIS would then look at that, and the majority of employers, you do have an opportunity to make representation on why you feel you don't need to be, you shouldn't be named in the press. To not get named is a very, very small, I usually say to clients, you know, even if you send representation, it's likely to be knocked back, because the only thing that they would consider is if it would put somebody at risk of harm and things like that. So the majority of investigations do end up getting on that naming and shaming list. Previously, there was a lot of, you may have seen it in the press, a lot of hoo-ha around, is it effective? You know, you're naming all of these businesses that are doing the right thing or trying to do the right thing and naming them for mistakes, labeling them as rogue employers, when, you know, is it losing its effectiveness? So they did temporarily suspend it, brought it back in 2020 with a couple of changes, but not very much, to be honest. So the criteria to be named and shamed previously is if you've got, previously it was if you've got any underpayment of £100. I mean, that's very, very, very small. You know, if you make a mistake, a small mistake going back 6 years, you know, it's definitely going over majority of the time £100. So that increased to £500, but again, that's really small. So a lot of businesses are still going to get caught out with that. And then the other changes were that they wanted to do more of education bulletins around that. And they did put that they would disclose the information of what businesses were named and shamed for. But when that's come out, I mean, the first round, it literally had it labelled as rogue employers, using them words. And then it didn't say, you know, whoever the employer is, you know, ended up on this list for a Christmas savings club. Didn't do that. It just named the employer, the amount that they have paid back, and then collectively they did an educational bulletin which kind of did highlight some of the things. But again, you weren't able to identify which had done what. So again, not much change there. It's definitely brings reputational damage, basically. And then there's other things that need to be considered from a liability point of view as well, because any arrears that do get paid back to workers need to be put through the payroll. We've got the usual employers' NICs, pension contributions, apprenticeship levy, etc., that need to be considered as well. So again, liabilities can get up pretty quick. So supporting, how do we support our clients in this space then? So I use a two-way approach. HMRC investigations, I really see the benefit of preparing my clients for an inspection, and what that allows us to do through that preparation is to really do a bit of I would put my HMRC hat on, for example, and review their documents and then take them through a HMRC meeting, for me to be able to identify what that current level of compliance is, and if we do have any scope for potential weaknesses. And what that allows us to do from a risk management point of view is, right, let's get some changes done straight away so that we can put a stop on any liabilities from accumulating. Especially when we've got penalties running of 200%, it allows us to put it right as soon as possible and stops them penalties ongoing, because what happens quite often is HMRC will come in and do an inspection and not really tell an employer that they're leading them down these garden paths, for example, and that they've identified something, but they're not going to tell them straight away until they've got more evidence to support that. The risk of that is that liabilities can massively, get out of hand. So that's why I like to do that education as soon as possible with them to prepare them, and we can discuss strategy at every stage. And what that does is absolutely reduces the stress, the pressure, and it simplifies the process, because it can get really complex and messy when you're dealing with HMRC through HMRC inquiries. And it also makes sure that the right determinations are made. Like, quite often, HMRC are not always making the right determinations, because maybe the employer hasn't realised that if they if they provide extra stuff, that they might be able to support that isn't a risk or there isn't a breach. So again, that's why it's important, is making sure that when any determinations are made, they're definitely the right ones, and that HMRC not being so tunnel visioned, after one thing without taking other things into consideration. And what I've found from working with HMRC in this way, I mean, you probably know this from doing other audits that you might be involved in PAYE and the likes, but working in this way, absolutely collaborating with HMRC gets a swifter conclusion, and also minimises that financial and reputational damage risk. I know we're running out of time, so I'll be super quick because this is the last slide. And then finally, why being proactive is absolutely key to reduce financial and reputational damage. There's an amazing opportunity for employers that haven't got that letter from HMRC yet, is to do some work in this space to future-proof them. Because if there is any potential weaknesses there within their practices, and sometimes it doesn't need massive amounts of changes to their practices, may just need some small tweaks or some implementing of a different procedure. But what that allows employers to do is to rectify the problems or weaknesses without attracting that hefty penalties and the government naming and shaming. And I usually use this 5-step approach. So that policy and document review, I'll deep dive into their operations and work and practices, test that against minimum wage legislation and how HMRC run an inquiry, so their practices, and then I can highlight, we can highlight to them, this is where we've got potential areas, what do we need to change to strengthen that? And then that absolutely reduces the risk. But that needs to be done in a way that's not going to limit their flexibility as well. So I guess that's the important thing, because through HMRC inquiries, HMRC may give some recommendations, and then it's limiting their flexibility with their workers and their workforce. And also the administration burden can massively increase. So it's how do we do them without increasing and losing that flexibility. So hopefully that's made
Okay, thank you.
sense.
Yeah, we've got a few questions before we release you.
Okay.
So are you saying the pay reference period is to be tested for each separate period for national minimum wage?
So the pay reference period, so say for example, if we've got a weekly pay reference period, in an ideal scenario, we need to be comfortable that in each individual pay reference period, in each month, that it's not going to cause a problem. Now, if we've got a really simple payroll of, say, for example, we just pay an hourly rate for the number of hours that they work, then would we need to check every single pay reference period every single month? Well, unlikely, because there's not much change in there. So as long as we set it to the right rates and we're comfortable with the hours, then that would be okay. Where you need to then implement any additional checks is if you've got any changes, if you've got any salary sacrifice, for example, or if you then start to do a deduction for different things. So that's why it's important to consider the checks at each individual one. But of course, just going back to that, the administration burden, if you've got a simple payroll and there's not much change and you're comfortable, then you're all right. You don't need to check at every single pay reference period.
Okay, is there any opportunity to get HMRC to mitigate the penalties, or is the 200% payable whether the reason is a simple error or mistake or a deliberate attempt to underpay?
Yeah, so this is, sorry, Barry, I think I should have covered this at the consequences. So this is very different to your tax inquiries. So, all that good stuff where if you're cooperating and if it's, deliberate or it's accidental, you get credits and you can reduce and negotiate on penalties, the like. So with minimum wage, unfortunately, it's way not as flexible at all. So the typical way is that whatever your underpayment figure is, you have a 200% penalty attached to that. Now, the reason why I hesitate saying that that happens every single time is that there is some potential scope to negotiate with HMRC in certain areas, for example. And I guess from me understanding all of HMRC's internal stuff, then yes, I definitely work with clients in this space, but you can try and negotiate. So some pointers that might give you on that. So HMRC's latest enforcement policy document give you some examples in there. So I would definitely recommend downloading that. And if you go to the penalty section, it'll give you some examples of where they might let you negotiate on a couple of things.
Okay, what's the process when HMRC discover any underpayment? Do they issue a determination that you then have the right of appeal, or is there an opportunity to engage before they make a determination?
So usually so the process is, if HMRC identifies a weakness, they should be telling you straight away, right, you've got a problem here, I need you to put it right, let's get future compliance. So hopefully they do that particular point. We've seen that not happen very often as well lately, to be honest. So, or at a too late a stage. But what they'll do is, once they've identified that determination, they'll hopefully tell you that there's a problem so you can put it right. But then they'll say, right, I need all of the rest of the information, the payroll, to be able to do an assessment on that. So there's a number of different things. You know, if you're a larger business, we usually do things called self-review, and the businesses would do them calculations with advisors, and we would do them calculations on behalf of HMRC. Or if it's smaller business, HMRC often say, give me the stuff and I'll do them calculations. They'll then do the calculations, and then the employer will be issued with an informal calculation, which will set out all the liabilities, so penalties and underpayments. And then at that point, you then go to what's called a formal notice, so notice of underpayment. But you can still, challenge and getting advice to make sure that they're right up until that informal stage, which is that example that I give about the smaller business, that school. They've come with a large settlement on their formal, and then and now we've head straight back into challenge on that informal piece. So there's still scope to question HMRC until you get to that notice of underpayment. At the notice of underpayment, you need to pay within 28 days, or take it to employment tribunal if you're not happy.
Okay, thank you. Are directors who take national minimum wage salaries and large dividends being looked at?
Oh, everybody always asks this, right? So, yes, they do get looked at, but it only comes into consideration when if there's an employment contract. So if there's an employment contract with if there's not an employment contract, then they are not due minimum wage, so it doesn't come into effect. But HMRC will ask the question, and if they say yes to that, then HMRC have been known to then go, well, how many hours do you do, and does your pay cover the amount of hours that you do? So although it's low risk, it's still a risk.
Okay, and lastly, somebody's asked, where would they find this enforcement document?
Right, okay.
You referred to.
Google NMW enforcement document, and it should come up. It's on the gov.uk website. Enforcement policy document.
Great stuff. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for that. Katie, can I thank you on behalf of all of our listeners, please, for a really comprehensive run through of national minimum wage. If anybody has any questions, Katie's very kindly put her contact details on the slides that we'll be sending round afterwards. So, Katie, I don't really want to say last goodbyes.
Yeah, just thank you so much. I've really enjoyed spending the last hour with you, and thanks, Kevin, for inviting me.
A pleasure. Honestly, thank you very much for your time. As I said, this is one of our usual monthly webinars. There'll be another one next month with Phil Berwick. I think it's on discovery, a topic that's very relevant at the moment. Thank you again for listening. We hope you've gained a lot of information from it. From the questions coming in, I think you certainly have. So thank you again for Katie, and we hope to speak to you all again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.